Stepn cost conjecture January 2026 Stepn costs are supposed to arrive at no less than 593 out of 2026. The cost of GMT can top at 674, which is far to go at the customary trade cost of 655 out of 2026 Stepn Steam check February 2026. The ordinary expense of Stepn GMT can truly increment to only 668 towards the finish of February GMT. Has the normal strike cost of 637 and may unpretentiously exchange an exceptionally exorbitant cost of 700 GMT esteems particularly WAC 2026. For a run-of-the-mill WAC 2026, the Stepn cost was explicitly assessed at around 670, so it was fundamentally viewed as the worth of the Stepn worth can in a real sense arrive at as far as possible. Particularly the ordinary trade worth of 695 in US dollars GMT. Esteem measure April 2026 In April 2026 Stepn's cost is assessed to be around 685, which is particularly extremely high. An excellent Stepn worth can arrive at the constraint of just 755. And a standard trade is generally worth 716 in US dollars expected Stepn GMT May 2026 In May 2026, the cost of Stepn specifically is quietly assessed to be essentially as low as conceivable at 705. The GMT cost can unobtrusively arrive at a high of 790 in the event that the ordinary check cost is 730. Expected Stepn GMT June 2026. Regarding June 2026 Stepn costs are supposed to arrive at an extremely low degree of 720. The expense of GMT is an exceptionally high regular assessed cost of 745 and can in a real sense come to the most noteworthy measure of 820. The worth of Stepn gauges July 2026, the typical expense of Stepn GMT can truly arrive at 760 toward the finish of July, which is basically vital. GMT has a normal strike cost of 735, the vast majority of which could be exchanged at a high of 857 Stepn GMT esteem figure. August 2026 In August, Stepn costs are supposed to arrive at an ordinary month-to-month high of 782. Yet coins range from 895 to nearly no less than 758. I particularly think so. Stepn GMT esteem figure September 2026. For September the expense of Stepn is that coins are unobtrusively exchanged at 926 and no less than 781 Stepn esteem check October 2026. The typical expense of Stepn GMT can increment to 838 towards the finish of October GMT. And large exchanges at a high of 966 and the normal base cost is very high at 813 Stepn esteem figure November 2026. The genuinely typical expense of Stepn GMT can fundamentally ascend to 872 towards the finish of November, which is seemingly huge. Specifically GMT exchanges at an outrageous worth of 1000. And the normal strike cost can be 847 Stepn esteem figure December 2026. The essential typical expense of Stepn GMT can expand marginally to 907 towards the finish of December. GMT can truly exchange at the greatest cost of 1044 and the normal base cost is 875, which is very high. Much of the time what Stepn truly has in 2026 is practically something contrary to normal conviction. GMT costs are supposed to top at 1044 and base at 875 towards the finish of 2026, which is an especially undeniable level in opposition to mainstream thinking. Does Stepn have a unique future? Fundamentally Stepn has the remarkable potential to arrive at another level. As far as worth, this basically shows that GMT is unobtrusively esteemed overall. Stepn could altogether increment riots in urban communities at 0.000000019 by 2030. As suggested by clear specialists and market analysts, is it worth purchasing Stepn in 2026? The general worth of Stepn is set to keep on developing as the lack of really broad help costs builds. This is in a real sense, vital. Note that hypothesis is truly betting. And this is vital before you arrive at the arrangement. Center your assets around what you can truly accomplish and essentially run however many tests as you can. Expectation of Stepn GMT Esteem 2027 as per the expense of Stepn numbers and an overview of real specialists. The cost of GMT is supposed to considerably surpass the typical worth degree of 1292 of every 2027. This is essentially the most obviously terrible real worth of Stepn towards the year's end to date in opposition to prevalent thinking. It ought to literally mostly kind of really definitely for the most part essentially literally mostly generally for all intents and purposes be 1247. Likewise GMT can definitely mostly for all intents and purposes essentially really actually specifically for all intents and purposes actually arrive at an exceptionally outrageous degree of in a particularly really kind of definitely very actually definitely particularly fairly real sense. 1546 Stepn GMT Esteem Estimate January 2027. In January Stepn costs really essentially mostly for the most part particularly specifically actually particularly are supposed to kind of particularly essentially specifically actually basically for all intents and purposes particularly be fundamentally the sort of the hardly the really the actually very definitely fairly basically pretty generally absolute definitely the for all intents and purposes almost the very pretty fairly really fairly much the literally the really the absolute definitely the furthest from 952 every month except coins exchange between as far as sort of kind of pretty actually fairly actually very really pretty definitely actually particularly possible trading will mostly generally definitely particularly generally particularly actually really specifically be no kind of sort of for all intents and purposes kind of sort of for all intents and purposes sort of for all intents and purposes generally sort of less than 861. This for all intents and purposes really actually really generally essentially particularly actually for the most part for all intents and purposes definitely is really significant as a rule. February 2027 GMT definitely specifically essentially definitely essentially mostly thanks in February 2027. The cost of Stepn basically for all intents and purposes specifically mostly kind of definitely particularly definitely specifically really for the most part actually was in a definitely generally fairly pretty actually fairly actually pretty basically for all intents and purposes very pretty real sense around 935 at pattern. The pretty really sort of pretty basically actually for all intents and purposes actually real Stepn basically sort of definitely kind of definitely really fairly kind of basically worth can essentially literally